Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday evening Chicago in Focus. My name is Jane Ruby, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago. I am so excited to have our speaker come and speak to us tonight. I weirdly just her post on LinkedIn about her senior thesis somehow showed up in my LinkedIn algorithm like a couple of months ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, how do I not appear really creepy? And how do I ask her to come and speak to our league and, our friends who are in this space as well. So I tried my best to not be like, a creepy fangirl. And I got her to, want to come and speak with us. So I am thrilled that all of you are here to join us. I will just speak for a few minutes about our organization and I will introduce our speaker and then turn it over to her. So, the League of Women Voters of Chicago is a nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights and ensure everyone is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy and education. The League of Women Voters of Chicago encourages informed and active participation in government while influencing public policy. We never endorse or oppose political parties or candidates, but we are political. We do this in two different roles. So we have voter service and citizen education. We present unbiased, nonpartisan information about elections, the voting process, and issues. And we also have an action and advocacy arm. We are nonpartisan, but after study, we use our positions to advocate for or against particular policies in the public interest. And the League of Women Voters of Chicago is a full nonprofit. We are a 501c3 designated organization. And this Chicago in Focus series, we've been doing it for many years now, where we pick topics that are relevant to Chicago, relevant to the state, relevant to the nation, to come and educate and inform our members and the general public on particular issues. And with the November election coming up, with a lot of us very actively involved and concerned about youth participation in this election, very hands on the ground in voter service initiatives, I think it is just so timely and so perfect to have June Park come and speak with us this evening. A little bit about June. She is an organizer and academic for youth voter engagement and voting rights. Originally from Havertown, Pennsylvania, June graduated from Harvard College in 2024, where she completed a 105-page senior thesis titled Teach Me Why and How to Vote, Then I'll Vote: The Effects of High School Voter Registration Drives on Youth Voter Participation. This work explored the impact of high school voter registration initiatives on increasing youth participation in elections and highlighted innovative strategies to engage young voters. Currently, June is working with Project 26 Pennsylvania, a nonprofit, nonpartisan youth voter organization, to get college students in Pennsylvania out to vote for the 2024 election. In the fall of 2025, June will return to Cambridge to attend Harvard Law School, where she plans to continue her studies. Outside of voting rights, she's an avid K-pop fanatic, USWNT soccer superfan, and crossword enthusiast. I don't know where you find time for all of those extracurriculars and the work that you're doing, um, but that is multitasking at its best. And I'm so thrilled to stop talking and turn it over to June.
Well, thanks so much, Jane. Again, it's been a real honor. Again, when Jane sent me the message, I was so excited to have a conversation with her, and I'm super honored to be invited to be part of the speaker series today. And so, um, I'm gonna yap for as little as possible, try to get you as much information, I think interesting information, both quantitative and qualitative about youth voters that hopefully you'll take away. But mostly I'm looking forward to kind of our conversation afterwards about how do we engage young people in this upcoming election. So thanks again for being here on such short notice. I was expecting like two people to show up, and we're already at 33 participants. So I'm really blessed everyone's here. But I'm gonna start sharing my screen, and I'm gonna go through a few slides. But at the end, I'll take any questions. And again, I'm looking forward to our conversation. So as Jane introduced, this year, so I just recently graduated from Harvard in May 2024, and I wrote a senior thesis that was 105 pages about high school voter registration drives. In the senior thesis, I looked to answer kind of two questions. The first is, do voter registration drives, right, increase high school students' voter registration and turnout rates? And then question two is, if it does, sort of what are the mechanisms through which the drives increase, right, high school students' participation? And I answered this question through both quantitative and qualitative analysis. For quantitative, I looked at the statewide and the high school level. And for qualitative analysis, I interviewed 32 high school students and was able to write questions and analyze results from a national survey of young Americans. Before we begin this presentation, why should we care about youth voters in the first place? In 2020, right, the presidential election margins were as you see here. I chose a few of the battleground states, but I want to highlight my home state of Pennsylvania. It was only 81,000 votes that the president was decided. And meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, there are around 671,000 college students. That's about 8 times, right, the election margin. Nationwide, right, each year, 4 million Americans turn 18 years old. And so, what does this all mean? This means that this upcoming election could be decided by a youth margin, especially in key battleground states. But this only happens if we get young people registered to vote and out to the polls on election day. But what is the current state of youth voter turnout, you might ask? And so here are graphs from my senior thesis where I looked at the trend of voter turnout by age group. And I want to bring your attention to the bottom lines. And this is subsetting the group to 18 to 24-year-olds. And as you can see, historically, right, American youth have struggled to vote at rates compared to other age groups, especially those, right, in 65 plus years old. When we look at youth voter turnout by state, right, on the left, we have the 2020 election. On the right, we have the 2022 midterm election. We see that there's a great range of youth voter turnout. And so, right, for example, the 2022 midterm, we had a range from 13 to 37%. That's a huge range of difference in terms of youth voter turnout. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the state level. And so I think the million-dollar question is, right, why are young people not voting? And the hint is that it's not just youth voter apathy. I argue it's not just youth voter apathy, but a multitude of reasons. First being that 4 in 5 young people actually believe that the outcome of the election will affect their everyday lives. This challenges the stereotype that young people, right, don't care about politics, they're not interested. We actually are. And in every presidential election from 2004 to 2020, more than 75% of registered young people voted. And this statistic is on par with other age groups, which suggests that once young people are registered to vote, they will vote. And in fact, I think this theory of voter apathy kind of reduces young people to one-dimensional voters who view politics in a super cynical light and fails to consider the effects of institutional and structural barriers to voting that disproportionately affects young people. And so my interviews with the high school students actually revealed a few interesting things. First is that young people lack a support circle who can motivate and teach them to vote. In more political sciencey terms, they lack sources of political socialization. One of our, I think our largest group, most influential group for political socialization is our peers. But for many young people, right, their peers are also first-time voters like themselves, with limited knowledge and experience about voting. I like to say that there's really little civic peer pressure. Okay, so maybe you don't have civically engaged parents, but you could have civically engaged, right, parents, right? But not everyone can be born into a politically active household. And even when young people grow up in such a household, they can still be disengaged with the political process or confused about voting. In fact, actually, quite a handful of students who I interviewed said they grew up in a politically active household, but struggled to vote for a multitude of reasons, but including that they just didn't know how to vote. I'll talk more about this in a second. So it seems like, right, peers and parents, young people struggle to find sources of political socialization. But what about high school, where many young Americans turn 18 years old? The good news, right, is that more than a majority of young Americans say that their high school prepared them to understand the importance of their vote. So high schools are doing this part of the um, civic education correctly. However, only 1 in 3 young Americans say that they've been taught how to vote in high school. That means 2 out of 3 young Americans have never been taught how to vote in high school, right? Their civic education failed them to teach them how to register to vote or even how to think about voting. And so this is a glaring, I think, gap in our civic education right now. And in fact, this chart is a little bit overwhelming, but let me break it down a bit. We asked, right, do you feel like your high school education taught and prepared you to understand? And on the left is different parts of voting. So, like the importance of vote, how to register to vote, how to research candidates and ballot issues, how to request and submit completed ballots, when the voting deadlines are. And then on the right, the different columns are broken down by, all young Americans. So that's 18 to 29-year-olds, likely 2024 voters, possible voters, and unlikely voters. And if you look at the top here, importance of vote, what I mentioned earlier is that across the board, right, high schools seem to be doing an okay job at teaching students the importance of the vote. But as you go through kind of the procedural steps of voting, as I'll call them, like how to register to vote, how to research candidates, how to request ballots, and even knowing when the voting deadlines are, you get down to almost even 33%. And so again, highlighting this section. I think this suggests that while high schools are doing a good job at teaching students why they should vote, they really struggle with teaching students the steps of voting. And in my research, actually, the number one reason for not voting is that young people disproportionately struggle with barriers to voting, especially the procedural steps of voting. In other words, even if young people understand why they should vote, they often don't know how to vote. And this kind of stems from, number one, a lack of voting information. Young people have little to no knowledge about the voting process, including knowing where to find answers to voting FAQs, such as information about required IDs or dates of voting deadlines. Young people don't even know where to start to kind of start their um, voter research. And as a result, I think one of the most difficult steps for young people and the first step in the voting process is registering to vote. A lot of young people, when I interviewed them, actually, those who were able to successfully vote told me that registering to vote was often more difficult than voting itself. And I had a handful of students speak to me, telling me that, for example, this quote I pulled, I want to vote, but with voter registration, there are all these steps that I would need to do and things to fill out. So I get overwhelmed. So oftentimes they can't even make it past the voter registration step, even though they want to vote. I think this is a huge problem. And so that's why, like, the main kind of thesis or one of my main arguments in my research is that young people need to know both why they should vote and how to vote. And so in this presentation and in my work, I'm going to focus especially on the how to vote. And so how do we increase youth voter turnout? Well, as of 2020, there are at least 881 colleges and universities that have pledged to organize voter registration drives on their campus. I featured 2 kind of national college organizations. Additionally, I was involved with two kind of local organizations. So Project 26 Pennsylvania, which 26 is in reference to the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18, not Project 2025. I know some folks were wondering about that. And which where I'm trying to get college students in Pennsylvania out to vote, and then the Harvard Votes Challenge, which was our local kind of student run organization at Harvard to get Harvard students out to vote. So, right, there's been a lot of kind of money, time, investment into college voters. As wonderful as I think these college efforts are, they only target, right, 40% of the 18 to 24-year-old population, leaving behind an astounding 60% of the population, otherwise known as the non-college enrolled youth. And so that's why I decided to focus at the high school level, because there is actually a growing literature on college level kind of voting and get out the vote initiatives, but there's little to none research at the high school level. And so, kind of, my research was trying to take a first stab at that. Additionally, the case for high schools, number one, is that 91% of young Americans have completed some sort of high school, right, compared to, right, 40% of young Americans who are currently enrolled in college. I also believe that high schools are powerful institutions that can cultivate young people's political interests before college or in place of college for those who do not continue their education. All right, um, most Americans will turn 18 years old during their senior year. So I think it's a really critical time to get them registered and out to vote as early as possible. And many states are instituting award-based high school voter registration programs, such as Pennsylvania's the Governor's Civic Engagement Award. The idea with these award-based programs is that states will incentivize high schools to host voter registration drives. For example, the Governor's Civic Engagement Award in Pennsylvania, if you registered like 85% of your senior class, you received like the gold level award, and the Secretary of State and the governor would send you like a plaque and things like that. And so we're seeing a lot of states kind of adopt this voluntary model to incentivize and increase the number of high school voter registration drives. And before I also continue further, I also want to give just a short definition of what a high school voter registration drive is. This is how I sort of defined it. Organized efforts typically led by school administrators, teachers, and student leaders to increase youth voter registration and participation by providing voting information, materials, and assistance to eligible students. And so, what's a little bit different about, I think, this is that um, it's not just about getting folks registered to vote, but it's also about kind of helping high school students plan out how they're going to vote in the future. And this is driven mostly by people in the high schools, right? School administrators, teachers, or students themselves. And so I first wanted to kind of get it analyze the effectiveness of high school voter registration drive programs across the states to see if, okay, if these programs do well, then I think it could be a good hint or suggestion that high school voter registration drives are effective. So I did some state level analysis into the three different types of programs states have adopted. So the first is the award-based program, like I mentioned earlier. As of 2024, there are 11 states, including Pennsylvania, that have adopted such a program. The second category that I grouped are just other programs. So, for example, Illinois' state mandate for high schools to provide voter registration forms. Certain states have also adopted like a holiday to celebrate high school voter registration week. So I kind of group that all together. And then the third category is no program. Around 9 states have no program related to high school voting. And so this top left graph here, it says it's just a map of the United States and what type of program states had in 2020. And then the bottom graph, again, is the 2020 youth voter turnout by state. You can see a slight correlation. So when I made these graphs, I saw a slight correlation. Similarly, the ones on the right are depicting the 2022 midterm elections. So I was like, this is interesting. There seems to be a correlation in which states that have either the award-based program or other program tend to have, I think, higher youth voter turnouts. And so really my question kind of wanted to first look at was, do states with high school voter registration programs demonstrate higher voter turnout rates than states without such a program? And so, running some linear regression models and other math stuff, I found the predicted statewide youth voter turnout in the 2020 election, pardon me. And so, what I found was that states with a program, just any program, had a youth voter turnout of 5 percentage points higher than states without a program. And if you break it down by the type of program, this actually increases the difference. States with award-based programs had a youth voter turnout rate that was 7.3 percentage points higher than states without a program. Um, Award-based programs also had a slight higher percentage point, but this difference isn't statistically significant, but still could hint that maybe perhaps this award-based program is the more effective kind of program for getting youth voter turnout. Okay, but I'm sure you're more interested about the high school voter registration drives themselves. And so what I did was I honed in on one state to look at the high school level, right? Before this, I was looking at the state level, how does state youth voter turnout compare to statewide high school voter registration drive programs. Now I wanted to focus in one state, look at high schools and compare their voter turnout and voter registration rates. So I picked Pennsylvania for three reasons. Um, First is that it has an award-based program. And so I could see when high schools opted into the program. They um so either they opt in to do a voter registration drive or they don't. And so this was easy for me to test. We also don't have pre-registration in Pennsylvania, and so I was able to kind of eliminate those effects since pre-registration is also it drives youth voter turnout. And then also Pennsylvania is my home state, so kind of home field advantage in terms of looking at the data. And so the goal was to calculate the voter registration and turnout rate at the high school level for 245 high schools. And so how did I do this? Because there is no data set out there that does this. What I did was I got the Pennsylvania voter roll. I also found PA high school enrollment data. And I combined these two to basically find registration turnout rate at the high school level. So the voter roll gave me the number of seniors who registered and the number of seniors who voted, while the high school enrollment data gave me the number of voting age seniors at the high school level. And so this is my favorite graph of all time. I think I'm most proud of this math, but I found the predicted registration and voter turnout rates in the 2020 primary election for an average high school in Pennsylvania. I specifically chose the primary election just to isolate, right, truly the effects of having a drive or not. Additionally, a lot of the way the academic school year is built is in the spring, you'll have more seniors eligible to register for the primary than you have seniors at the beginning of the academic school year to be able to vote in the fall election. So other reasons, but basically I chose to do the 2020 primary election to really isolate the effects of the drives. And what I found is that on the left in the dark red, folks, is the high schools with the voter registration drive. And you can see they have much higher voter registration and turnout rates. So, in fact, high schools with the voter registration drive had a voter registration rate that was 15 percentage point higher and a voter turnout rate that was 3 percentage point higher than those of high schools without a drive. And these numbers, right, the 3% might seem like a little, but it's actually a lot in this literature. We're looking at if you can find a difference about 2 to 4% in voter turnout, it means it's pretty effective. And so to see that high school voter registration drives could have impact of 3 percentage point higher in voter turnout, I think bodes well for the effectiveness of high school voter registration drives. And so again, high school voter registration drives are effective at increasing both voter registration and, in fact, turnout rates. But how do high school voter registration drives help young Americans to vote, right? I think it's kind of self-explanatory why the voter registration rates increase, but what about the voter turnout rates? I found two key mechanisms in which voter registration drives helped high school students. First is that these drives provide not only essential voting materials, so like, right, the voter registration form itself, like pens and things like that, but more importantly, the crucial voting information to young people. This picture on the left is from a mandatory assembly that one of the high schools I interviewed had. And so they sat the entire senior class down and went through this entire presentation that walked through the entire voter registration form, talked about the steps then to get prepared for the upcoming primary election. And so a student organizer kind of said, quote, a drive gives students the physical materials they need. But more importantly, I think it also breaks down the voter registration and voting processes into easier steps and demystified stereotypes that voting is hard. And so, right, students were able to register to vote because they had the help and the materials that they needed. Additionally, what was interesting I found was that this is from a student participant in the drive, but they said, quote, during the school day, I only focus on schoolwork. Then outside of school, I'm worried about homework, sports, and other stuff. It wasn't until the assembly that I had the time to register, which was super helpful. And so, a surprising kind of thing that came up often, a pattern, was that a lot of these high school students mentioned that they are really hyper focused on graduating. They have a lot on their plates. And even though they really want to vote, they didn't have this time to really sit down and think about voting. So when you do something like a mandatory assembly, it helps students to really just find that time to vote. In fact, a different student participant said, I didn't think I was going to vote, but when I showed up to the assembly, they made it so that you couldn't not register, which I thought was awesome. The second mechanism is that drives foster civic values through peer pressure to make voting seem cool to this group of highly impressionable first-time voters. Okay, what does this mean? Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of young people don't have a robust peer network of folks who have voted before or have a lot of knowledge about voting or frankly even care about voting. Um, but these drives, what they do is they make voting a highly visible and highly talked about kind of topic at their high school. And so this picture I show you is at one of the drives at the high school. They printed out the flyers to obviously I think it was flyer for the mandatory assembly, and then they spelled out vote using the flyers, which I thought was really creative. And the reason they were telling me was that they wanted to make it sort of like they described it like the week up like the week leading to homecoming. They wanted to be like the week leading up to the voter registration drive. So they hyped it up over social media, physically in their, hallways of their high school so that like everyone knew that the voter registration drive was happening and like people were getting excited for it. And this was such a contrast to conversations with high school students who didn't have a drive. They often mentioned things like that it felt like a taboo to talk about politics in their cafeteria. No one really talked about voting and things like that. Such a kind of contrast in um, this civic culture, as I like to call it. Additionally, this is a great quote from a student participant, but they said, quote, I think having students encourage other students to vote was super helpful because we're all in the same boat. It didn't feel patronizing when my friends try to help me to vote compared to when some adults try to help me before. So what we found was, again, that sort of like civic peer pressure. Um, One of my favorite stories that I heard from interviewees was that the student organizer was like going around homerooms and they were trying to get this group of like football players to get registered to vote. At first, none of them were really budging, but then one player was like, "Hey, like you know what? Like let me just register to vote," and then immediately the entire circle just followed through and did it. Which I thought was just an incredible example of like really positive civic peer pressure. And so, what are some tactics that seem to work well, and what are some tactics that didn't seem to work well in my interviews? Well, first, the tactics that do not really work. One was the first one is the supply of only voting materials, like dropping off voter registration forms at desks. Some high schools had tried to like they printed out a bunch of voter registration forms and dropped it off on every student's desk. But this wasn't effective because a lot of students A didn't know what a voter registration form looked like before, so they actually like recycled it and they found like the forms like just like lying on the classroom floor, which is like really sad. Um, and then one-off emails with the voter registration link, like, right, sometimes principals will just send off this one-off email being like, hey, like, register to vote. Oftentimes, high school students are not checking their email or they forget about it. And so, this one-off email, I think, is not really effective. Passive tabling in high traffic areas like the cafeteria was also ineffective because, right, it forced students to go up to their table rather than the student organizers actually going to those students and opening conversations. And so then let's talk about the tactics that did work well. One was the mandatory assembly that walks students through the voter registration process step by step. This one was like, at least qualitatively, it seemed like one of the most effective things. You had everyone in the room focusing on a voter registration, and if there were questions, they could be answered right then. And right, you have that civic pressure, right, because everyone around you is registering to vote, so I might as well register to vote. Frequent reminders of voting deadlines was awesome. So it's not just a one-off email, it's a constant like, hey, I know one high school did like a countdown until like the voter registration deadline. Again, dedicated time to complete voting related tasks, even if it's just a 25-minute assembly, it really helps students kind of focus on voting outside of their really busy kind of student lives. And then one-on-one outreach by student leaders and or popular teachers was really effective, making that connection. So it's not just like some random person speaking to students, but it's like your friend or like your favorite social studies teacher asking you to register to vote. So those are some tactics I think that worked well. An example of a successful drive at a PA high school was three phases. First is that they did this mandatory assembly to register as many students as possible in one sitting. Then they followed it up with active tabling to further engage with students and answer additional questions during lunchtime. They would like go up to their peers during lunch, not just sit at a table. And then finally, they followed up with some one-on-one outreach. So, to have conversation with the remaining students during the advisory period. I think the idea was they wanted to have at least one conversation with the entire senior class, which I think they were actually able to do, which is pretty incredible. And so now we're kind of heading into some policy recommendations. I'm sure we talked a lot about Pennsylvania. We talked a lot about the national level. Kind of bring it in and focus on Chicago and Illinois for a second. So in Chicago, it seems like there's more than 160 high schools. In Illinois, there's around like 1,300 high schools. Again, I'm not sure about this data. I just pulled this off of Google. But there is a lot of potential there, right? Um, a lot of potential, a lot of high school students you can get engaged. In fact, Illinois as a state has a lot of room for growth. Here are the most recent midterm and presidential election data. There is no data for 2022, but I pulled at least 2016, 2018, and 2020. Illinois is right in the middle of the pack. But for example, like 28, right, 27% is pretty abysmal. So I think there's a lot of room for growth. Additionally, Illinois does not have an award-based high school voter registration program, so I'm not suggesting that like you have to have like an award-based program. But I think any efforts to encourage high schools to have voter registration drives, to make it not a taboo to have these voter registration drives, I think really helps not only the students registering to vote, but also students hosting these drives. They get a lot of like organizing skills that they can take on for the rest of their lives. And if you want even more granular level kind of like policy recommendations, this is another poll question from the National Poll of Young Americans. We asked when deciding whether and for whom to vote in 2024, how helpful would you find the following? We broke it down by Democrat, Republican, Independent. But you can see all of these more than a majority of Americans, in fact, like a lot of Americans think that the following are really helpful, right? Reminders about voting deadlines. Again, for young people specifically, the academic school year doesn't match on to like the voting deadlines, right? It's like a lot of folks are telling me they're like, why is the voter registration day or like election day on random Mondays or Tuesdays? Like, it doesn't really fit in with their like midterm schedule or things like that. Nonpartisan voter guides. Young Americans do want to vote, but they want sort of like a nonpartisan kind of voter guide to help them choose their candidates. And oftentimes they get really overwhelmed when starting this research. So having that they said was really good. Conversation about voting with friends or family. Again, building that peer circle of engaged voters, nonpartisan how to vote trainings, and then meeting a candidate was at least for the Democrats, and the independents was the least popular. But still, I think if you're looking for specific things to incorporate into getting young people out to vote, these are a few places I think you could get started. And finally, we've reached the end, but the conclusion to wrap up, to remind you of the big points, is that high school voter registration drives are effective. There's a difference of 15 percentage points in voter registration and 3 percentage point in voter turnout, which these are not just statistics to blow off. This is, I think, really huge. And high school voter registration drives transform voter registration and voting from daunting bureaucratic tasks reserved for adults into empowering tools accessible to young people. One of the my favorite quotes was from someone whose high school had an annual high school voter registration drive, and it always happened in the spring, and they were like, "Yeah, um, if I don't register to vote in like it's weird if I don't register to vote in the voter registration drive. Like it became so much part of their culture, like it became so obvious, like and normalized for them. And again, that this is such a rare case because the majority of high school students that I interviewed either didn't have a voter registration drive or as like robust voter registration drive experience. So kind of hearing that solidify once you get this into the high schools, it can really transform, I think, a lot of high school students civic engagement careers. And so the title of my senior thesis, the title of my research actually came from a direct quote from a student. And when I asked him, what would help you to vote? They just straight up said this, teach me why and how to vote, then I'll vote. And so, if there's anything to take away from my presentation today, I hope that it's that you believe in the youth vote. We have a lot of potential, but to unlock that potential, we need to really, I think, invest in young voters and think about it's not only talking about the broad level, like this is why democracy is important. Actually, a lot of young people understand that, but they're looking for really the tangible, like cut through the BS kind of steps. Like here is the voter registration link. These are the things you need for voter registration. Here's how to submit your voter registration, et cetera, et cetera. So yes. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I actually look forward to the second part of this part, which is having a conversation with you. So, happy to answer any questions, but thank you so much.
And uh, thank you so much, June. I've heard some of this before, but every time I hear you talk about this stuff, like first I see your passion and also you get me all hyped up about youth voter turnout and registration as well. So it's always a good reminder for me. For everyone on the Zoom, if you want to put questions in the chat, we already have some questions going that we'll kind of go through. Or if you feel more comfortable like raising your hand, just use the it's now hidden under the heart react thing, but there's a raise your hand like button is hidden there now. So if you want to ask your question that way, use that. And we'll go ahead and get started with the Q&A part. So first of all, we have a question regarding like time of year for high school registrations. So someone wanted to ask if it's better to do it in the spring after more students have turned 18.
That's a great question. So yeah, I think you're right about thinking the number of high school students right in the fall, right before the fall November election. Um, there's not actually a lot of students. I remember in my high school, it was like I was like the only person. I was one of very few folks who are actually eligible to vote in November. I think that doesn't mean that you shouldn't host a drive, but I think, right, you can, I think high schools, like we use that fall period to do a test, like a mini test drive. But I think the best time really for high school students is in that spring. Um, because right there's more high school students that you can get registered to vote, and also you have a little bit more of a room because for example, at least in Pennsylvania, our school year started in like the last week of August, beginning of September. And so once students started school immediately, like they had to, like we only had like 3 weeks to prepare for the voter registration drive, whereas in the spring we had the entire year leading up to, I think we usually did it in the beginning of April. And then right folks would practice going to the primary election, and then they would go off to the general election when they went off to college. But I think personally for me, there is not a better answer, but you're going to get more students, I think, and more engagement in the spring. But obviously, right, we have the November election, so it's definitely doable. And so I suggest you still doing a mini version of a drive in the fall.
Great. So we have someone, we have Margie who has raised her hand. So Margie, you're up.
I thought your slide said that the youth voters weren't impressed by having a candidate speak to them, or did I misread it? Because if I didn't misread it, why? Because when I was in high school, when a candidate came, that was a big thing. So,
Yeah, yes, I can bring up that slide again, because that slide has a lot of information. So it's not necessarily they're not impressed, but out of the different recommendations we had floated, it was definitely the lowest. Oh, the lowest interest. All right. I mean, interesting among Republicans, it was 61%, but among Democrats and independent, it goes down to 40 and 48 and 59%. So I still think a majority of young Americans would appreciate, right, meeting a candidate, but it's definitely not their top, I think, interest when trying to decide whether and to whom vote for in 2024.
do you know why? Because I just found it interesting. Do you know why they said it wasn't important?
I don't have exact the why, but my guess is in speaking to a high school student is that I think they already get enough information about the candidates, and it's more like um they are looking for, I think, more tangible things. Like meeting a candidate, I think is definitely nice. I think they would get excited, but it's like to them, it's like it's not really gonna help me to vote. Like what I need to vote is like their voting information. Like I'd rather get like their bio, their like where they stand um on different issues. I think is sort of my guess.
Thank you.
Uh, all right. Our next question is, and this is sort of, I guess, specific to civic organizations that actually go into the high schools and help, facilitate voter registration drives. If the league cannot get into a high school for whatever reason, are there other places or tactics to meet high school students where they are?
Yeah. First, big shout out to the League of Women Voters. They were actually one of the first groups that I interacted when I was the first person in my family to be able to vote. And the League of Women Voters over in Pennsylvania actually helped me to register to vote. And so I have a lot of love for you guys and for what you do. Yeah, always the difficulty, right, is trying to get into the high school, I'm sure, as a nonprofit. I think one of the best ways is either to go through is to find students. So if you know of any high school students, like I think the way my high school did the voter registration drive was I sort of wanted to do it. So I approached my principal and was like, hey, I want to do this. I think that's much more effective than someone like an outside person coming in and right asking the principal to do it. So if you're able to kind of use your network, find like your next door neighbor's kid who's a high school student and be like, is there like a teacher or a student who'd be interested in doing this? Like, and emphasizing, like, that the league would help with like building all of the material out, like, right, present, the voter registration forms and presentation and stuff like that. But also I don't think high schools are opposed to having the league and especially when you emphasize as a um nonpartisan organization just interested in doing voting. So I think if you're able to find a student that's the best student or teacher that's the best and have them reach out to their principal or school administrator, I think that's the best way to get the ball rolling on a voter registration drive.
Great. Next up, we have, does your analysis showing better turnout with high school voter registration drives, and then in parentheses it says the 3%, include both passive and more active voter registration drives?
Great question. That is the next stage of research that I'm hoping to do is to really break down like what is the most effective type of voter registration drive. It just looked at if high school had a drive. So if you're interested how I determined that, I just pulled from the each year the Pennsylvania Governor Civic Engagement Award lists all the high schools that took part in it. And so right if they took part in it, they have a voter registration drive. Also reached out to high schools to ask if they had some sort of a drive. Um, but and then in the qualitative interview, that's where I was able to kind of pull that it seems the active methods were much more effective, right? Talking to folks who had the passage drive, such as dropping off the forms, that just wasn't as effective as having the mandatory assembly, having the one-on-one conversations. That was much more effective. I don't have the numbers, but hopefully someday I do.
Wonderful. So we have Sharon who has raised her hand. Sharon, you're up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm in the Chicago area, so I appreciate this. I've been trying to get into some of the high schools. I'm a voter registrar, and I've been trying to get into some of our local high schools. I've been successful with one particular high school, but I've experienced both of the things that's been discussed tonight. I was able to get into this particular high school, and I've registered high school seniors
Mhm.
at their assemblies for a graduation rehearsal. So they were literally being held captive,
Yep.
and I was able to get quite a few of them registered. However, it really is difficult if you can't get the teachers on board. The principal was on board for letting me come in and do this, but the teachers weren't. And so that did reduce my numbers. This year, my numbers were a lot lower than they were last year. But then on the other hand, I was in another school where the kids registered, but then there's that follow up to actually getting them to the
Yep.
polls to vote. So it's one six at the other, as opposed to getting them registered, which I've had a modicum of success. But then there's the other side of, well, once you get them registered, how do you actually get them to exercise
Yeah.
their right to vote? Do you have any input on that, or?
Yeah, you pointed out two big things. One is, yeah, having that teacher support is super key. We found a lot of success when like plugging in social studies teachers. They're often like the social studies or English teachers seem to be the most interested, especially if a student, like that's how I did my own voter registration drive. I got an English teacher who was a sponsor of a club to kind of help me do this. Yeah, the way I pitched it to her was like, I am going to do like all of the work. I just need you to support me like when speaking to the principal and school administrator. So I guess like ideally, right, is trying to find a student leader who's very passionate about this, and it opens up a lot of doors. The second point, right, you make a very important point about it's not just about voter registration, it's about getting them to the polls too.
Getting them to the polls, yeah.
Yep. A lot of that has to, I think, do with that civic peer pressure. So in high schools that had the voter registration drive, they didn't just end there, like really successful ones. They didn't just end there. They like, um, they would do like countdowns to like the primary election. They're like 30 days until the primary election, and they would actually go to polls together. So I like friend groups would be like, hey, I'm at the high school, right? They would at certain high schools they had election day off, so they would go to the polls together. And so I think making election day kind of a fun event seemed to be something again like to look forward to, like the stickers and stuff like that. And I think a lot of it is maybe this is a good problem to have. Young people just need reminders about things like election, especially the primary election. So like once you just like constantly you're like, hey, it's next Tuesday. They were like most likely to vote. They just you needed to remind them also on the day of, like, hey, polls are open. So if you're able to kind of not just stopping at the voter registration drive, but if you have a list of all these students, right, contacting them constantly, almost to the point they memorized your number, they memorized your name, to get them out to, I think, election day. But
I
thank you
think
for all the work you do. That's awesome.
Oh,
I
well,
think
thank you. Thank you.
a great follow-up to another question we had in the chat, which is what is the best approach for communicating voting reminders to students? Like, is it social media or email or, if you have their phone number to text remind them or, what are some tips?
I think the best thing is as many avenues as possible. So, like in an ideal world, right, the principal would be sending out emails, like constant emails to not only students but also the parents. Like remind the parents to remind their kids to vote. I think that's like, that's right. Remember, like the whole kind of peer effect is not just, sorry, political socialization is not just the peers, not just the high school, but there's also the parents. There's that. I think I've talking to a lot of young people, social media was really effective when they see like because they're constantly on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and things like that. If they see it and everyone's celebrating it as a holiday or celebrating as an event, I think that's effective. Text messages work only when it's from someone I think that they know. So, some high schools would do relational texting. So, like the day of the voter registration drive or the day of election, they would all sit down for an hour and they'd be like, "Hey, I'm going to text 20 of my friends to remind them to vote. That was much more effective than some random like text spam, I think.
Great. And that's also a great follow-up question. And Pat, I do see your hand, so I want to get to yours, but there was one in chat. Do you see a correlation between parent voting stats and youth voting stats? And is that something like, is there data available to sort of really assess maybe also what's happening in the home between parent and child?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of research out on this about parent like voting status and child's voting status. It's there's a high correlation. It's generally when the parent is voting, especially if you take the kid, right, voting, that the kid will vote. But just because there's a correlation, right, doesn't mean it's a causation. So just because you have a parent doesn't mean it will equal to you voting. In fact, like one of a student that I interviewed, she went to a Catholic high school. Her mom took her to the polls every single time, but she just never ended up registering to vote or voting, even though she seemed interested in it. It just timing, there was a multitude of reasons. And so um I think having parents who are engaged is definitely one of the greatest pluses you have. But that high school, at the if I think high school, right, everyone goes in high school. um if the high schools can do it, you can grab students, right, who don't have politically active friends, but you can also grab the students who also have politically active parents, but maybe they just are not getting it. Because sometimes, right, unfortunately, kids don't want to listen to their parents, but if they hear it from a teacher or student, maybe they'll listen a little bit better.
I always start like when people ask me how did I become president of the league, it always starts with I was the kid that my parents would drag into the voting booth
Yeah.
and I'd be flipping the switches back in the day thinking I was voting and I'd be telling people I'd be voting and it's like I wasn't actually the one voting, but I think that that really very much set the tone for kind of where I ended up in life. So I'm totally right there with you. All right, we have Pat who has her hand raised. So Pat, you're up.
For the past 8 years, I've been coordinating voter registration programs in the Chicago Public Schools. What I do is I sit down and I go to each school's website. I get the name of the principal, I get their email address. I go to the names of the social studies teachers, I get their email addresses, and then I send out an invitation in the spring and in the fall for league members to come and do voter registration events. I can either do it two ways. Either we come into the school and do it, have a group of people from the league helping out with voter registration, or I'll supply the information so the teachers and the students can do their own voter registration events. We also do open houses for in the evenings for parents at schools. So we supply information for voter registration, change of address, that sort of thing. I also, with each of the schools, I ask for student helpers because they know the kids that are old enough to vote, and they can go around. If you, I know you said that the lunch table is not the best way, but sometimes that's the only offer that we have. But to have four kids from that class sitting at the table with me and then going out and putting their tapping on the shoulder of their friends who they know are old enough to register to vote and bring them over to the table to get them registered to vote. It all depends on the school and what they're comfortable doing. So I've had teachers bring classes in one at a time. I've had we sat in one school and rang a cowbell every time a kid registered to vote. We've had all kinds of different ways of doing it. So you really have to tailor your approach. And I think, and particularly, the League of Women Voters has such a great reputation for being a nonpartisan organization that we're more welcome into the school than maybe some organizations that have an agenda about, even though they say they're nonpartisan, the schools may be a little wary of it. So if anybody on this uh, get together is interested in doing voter registration at high schools, I just sent out the information to the principals, and tomorrow I'm sending it out to the social studies teachers, and we're going to be lining up events. And we're going to be doing it all through the month of September up until the deadline, which is for at least for our 275 form, October 8th. So let me know if you're interested in helping out.
Thank
I
you
guess
so
what I want to also know from you is there something that we could be doing while we're doing the voter registration? We'd have I send a follow-up with the Illinois voter guide to the sponsor who has given it so that they can distribute it to the kids. And that has, they can go online, get their ballot, find out who's on their ballot, where they're supposed to vote, and all those kinds of things, and what the issues, how each of the candidates feel about specific issues, and also too on the Vote for Judges website too. So because we want to make sure the kids now know that there's a little bit longer ballot than just the president and the vice president. So when we're in the process of doing these voter registrations, other than handing out the voter registration guide, and is there anything else that you think that we could do to encourage the students to get to the polls? I know some of the schools organize a march to the polls, which is great, but it really does depend on the teacher and the administration of whether or not that's available.
Pat, first and foremost, thanks for all that you do. This is awesome to hear what you've been doing for all these years. It warms my heart. Like this is exactly the model you're doing is exactly what I would love to see, not only across Illinois, but actually across all the states. It's what I've been um what I found is that once you tell high schools that, hey, the high school next door is doing exactly the same thing and they're doing it really well, they kind of get amped up and they want to do it too. It's just, I think there is a lack of word of mouth or something's not happening where a lot of high school administrators are, I think, scared to do something like this, right? Because of the political climate, and they think that no other high school is doing it. In fact, a bunch of high schools are doing it. And so kind of getting the word that this is a normal thing, a lot of high schools are doing it. Again, sort of why that award-based voter registration program that I mentioned earlier is cool because you can see the list of high schools who took part in it. You can see the list of high schools that won awards. I think it really does a good job of building a culture. Regarding your point about what to do during the actual drive itself, I found it super helpful, right? The students have the form in front, like let's say ideally they have the form in front of them, they have the pen in front of them. It's really helpful when you have students, especially like their peers, like almost like over their shoulder or at least like nearby to help answer questions. Because I remember like we got so many students in the county section wrote USA because they misread it as country. Like I'm sure you guys have run into yes, thank you for putting all those incredible voting links. Like yeah, we would give them links and stuff like that. And so right, I think having someone there who can speak the students' lingo and walk them through each, because that's what I think the young people want is they want someone just to walk them through each section. I know for us, we're like we don't want to overdo it. We don't want to maybe they get bored in the middle. That's actually what they want is you to go through like every single step so they're not making mistakes. I also think one thing in high school did was after at the end of the assembly, they also gave these like pledge to votes. So the students could take it with them. So not only are they leaving, they're going to submit their voter registration form to the students to mail off to the county board of elections, but they also left with like a little like post-it note or something that had like the date of the election. Here's how to vote. Here's how to find more information. That's crucial. They want to know what website to go to. I often do vote 411 the League of Women Voters website. I always do that one. I think having them have something tangible, not only getting constant reminders, but having something tangible as a reminder, I think is always great.
Okay. Well, I think if we put something with the Illinois voter guide as to what the dates are, and and also too, I said I'll send a follow-up to the sponsor and ask them to parlay the information to the students as to, when, if the voter, because the voter guide may not be available by the time when I go into the classrooms. So I keep sending follow-up information to be distributed by the teachers. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pat. And you did do a wonderful job of plugging a lot of incredible resources that we use in our voter registration stuff. So you definitely beat me to that at the end of at the end of my talk. So we just have a couple more questions, June, if you're able to kind of stick around.
Of course.
So we have someone in the chat asking, what about mock elections? Are these found to be helpful in teaching students about voting? Are they worth the effort?
Ugh, Mocklet, yes. The short answer is yes. If you can not only build a voter registration drive, but you can have a mock election part of it, I think it's super helpful. One of the students I interviewed, he was from like a magnet or like a private school, and they had the funding to not only do a drive, but they had the county board of elections wheel in their voting machines. They were actually able to practice voting on the machine before election day. That was super helpful compared to, right, one high school student, right, who was super well prepared to vote, showed up, and almost got their vote canceled because they had never experienced actually voting on the machine and like filled out the thing wrong. But, thankfully it got resolved. But yes, having any additional step to, I think my emphasis here is like the bare minimum is a voter registration drive, and that everything else you can add to it to remind students to vote, to practice voting is super helpful.
Great. And another question from chat. Is it better for college students to register to vote in their home community or in their college community?
Great question. Do you want the nonpartisan answer? Do you want the partisan answer is the question. I'll give you the nonpartisan answer first. It is wherever they can be on Tuesday, November 5th is the answer. Right, I always tell when I'm registering folks to vote, I always tell them election day, if you're not going to vote by mail, which is a whole other process, but if you want to vote in person, at least in Pennsylvania, because we don't have early voting, you got to get to the election on a Tuesday. And I'm sure you're going to have class or work on Tuesday. So can you realistically drive 3 hours back home to vote? Or is it more sensible for you to register to vote, right, in your college where your polling place hopefully is on campus and you just have to walk up and do it really quickly? If you want the more partisan answer, if they're going to school in like Pennsylvania and they're from like California, if their home is from California, I think the right answer, right, would be to register to vote in Pennsylvania. But again, every vote matters. But there are certain states where I think the election margin is closer.
Great. Sharon, you have your hand up again. Do you have a follow-up question? Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to ask Pat. She talked about doing the registrations in the high school. If she was able to just go into the schools, maybe through the principal and do it. I've found, and I don't know if it's just the area we live in Chicago, that there's a lot of kind of like red tape or something.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes.
Oh,
Plenty of
okay.
red tape. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only problem with the Chicago getting into the Chicago schools is
Yeah.
there's a two-part way of being approved. You have to go through an approval process, and they have to make sure that you are a reputable person before they're going to allow you in the school. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I provide that for all the volunteers that help me out. I give them the information about where they have to go and how they have to go through the process, and then put them in contact with the person at the school that they have to submit their IDs to and all that. So I help with all that.
Okay. I'm wondering if I might have better luck if I put my email in the chat and you send me the information that you give your volunteers. You
Okay.
mentioned you give your volunteers certain information for how they can get into the schools. Because I've been dealing with two. One, I've been relatively successful. The other one, not so
Why
much.
don't why don't we talk offline, and I can help you, okay?
Okay, I'll put my information in the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So someone else under Sophie's name, just so you know, June, Sophie's our communications coordinator. So because she sent out the Zoom, there's a bunch of Sophies on the chat. So the Sophie that has their hand raised, did you want to ask your question? Or they might have just put their hand down. If anyone has any sort of last minute questions, either in chat or raising your hand, in the interim, I'll kind of go through some great things that we sort of have coming up in this space. One thing that I did plug earlier in the chat, but I do want to sort of, make a plea for everyone who is in the voter registration space going into schools this August and September. One of our incredible superstar league members here in Chicago and Illinois, Tina Brady Pettis, on her own has launched a Get Out the Vote for Teens initiative here in the state where she goes around and is very active in high schools registering teens. June, we just recently, January of this year, allowed pre-registration of 16-year-olds. So that has kind of opened up a lot of really great possibilities across the state for getting teens more activated. And she has also created National Teens Voter Registration Day, which will be September 10th of this year. It is the inaugural one. So anything, June, you can do to kind of activate in your networks around September 10th, we'd love to plug you into that work. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff with the league around that day too. You know, especially based on your presentation and a lot of the anecdotal stuff. You know, it is really important to get youth engaged in this election and beyond. And we'd love to sort of have you back at a later point when the data has been collected and see how much better we've done. So this is like a call for everyone on the call who, you know, is very competitive. Let's try to get our percentage points up for this election, data-wise. I will also say that, you know, we are very shortly going to publicly announce a partnership with Common Cause Illinois around election protection. So there's and I put the link in the chat, 866 our vote. So going into early voting and election day, election intimidation, voter suppression, a lot of young people have concerns about those sorts of things. We're, you know, actively going to be recruiting people to be poll watchers, election judges, poll workers, especially young people. It's important for them to be civically involved in that. So if anyone is interested in helping in those initiatives, please let me know. And then, you know, obviously Pat is sort of our superstar in Chicago around voter registration in the high schools. So please connect with her further for more information. And before we, you know, end today's
Jane,
event.
can I give my email address? I don't see Sharon's email.
Yeah.
pwild4@aol.com.
Okay. I will put that in the chat for everyone.
Okay.
pwild4@aol.com.
Okay.
Jane,
I did put my information in the chat. It's not visible.
I didn't see it.
You sent it to me, Sharon, so I will make sure that
Oh, okay. When
yeah.
I clicked on trying to access the list, it only gave me 2 names and they were LWV names.
Yeah, that's fine. I put it in the chat for everyone.
Okay.
So
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Plugged in. And I'm sorry, my cat also is very excited about high school voter registration. So he's been joining us. June, did you have any sort of final thoughts you wanted to put out there?
yeah, so I'm gonna put also my email in the chat. I would love to stay connected to hear about your efforts at Illinois. Ideally, I don't think there is like a great organization out there, so I don't know if the league would like to take this on, but like a nationwide kind of like effort to really have voter to encourage high schools to have voter registration drives. I there is really a lack. Like there's a lot of great college organizations, but I think there is a great gap in the high school. So if anyone's interested, like thinking through this, I would love to hear more about your experiences. Right, I like getting the data. I like getting the anecdotes, but I also want to make progress um as someone who cares deeply about, you know, equity, especially for high school voters and things like that. And so you know, if this means starting in Illinois to build up something that then expands nationwide, I would love to think through how can we kind of use civic peer pressure to get high schools to do voter registration drives all across the country for this election and beyond. But yeah, well, so my email is in the chat. So please, 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 reach out. I would love to connect with you. And thank you again for this incredible opportunity to hear me just talk about my favorite thing, high school voter registration drives.
Thank you so much. And I would like to say, because I caught you like literally right after you graduated in your LinkedIn post, I hope I'm like one of the founding members of the June Park fan club. Because you just like you doing this and being in this space and having this enthusiasm, like you inspire me, and I'm sure everyone else on this call and beyond is going to be equally inspired. So you are just a superstar, and anything that we can do on the league side to amplify and promote your work and, really get those numbers up, get more people to care in the space. We are friends for life now.
Yes. Thanks, Jane. And big, big thank you to Jane for inviting me. This would not have happened without her. So